next up is Brendan Wintle, and I'll tell you a little bit about Brendan. So Brendan is Director of the Nest Threatened Species Recovery Hub. He's also an absolute national leader in injecting ecological science into policy. And of course, he's world famous for his appearance on Four Corners, standing up for our threatened species and the need for some reform in that area. Now, I haven't asked Brendan about this, and he'd probably tell me not to say it, but I understand there was some flack that came back to Brendan and the others who spoke on Four Corners. So there's still pressure, even at the, our very best ecologists still feel that pressure to not speak up on behalf of biodiversity. So anyway, Brendan's here to make us more depressed with his title, Extinction Crisis, Ecosystem Collapse, Post-Truth Politics and Other Fun Reasons Why the World Needs Ecologists. Go for it, Brendan.
Thanks, Don. Can I just start by saying no comment? It's really such an honour to be here at what I think is Australia's most important professional society conference. It's the conference that deals with existential risk, the risks that we face due to the changes in the environment, the loss of biodiversity, the loss of ecosystem services. And it's just so wonderful to have seen over the last couple of days the way the society and the way the conference has really oriented towards solutions and really recognising that role of ecologists and the society in bringing solutions forward. So it's just so inspiring. It's been great for the last couple of days. My work, my workplace and my work takes place on Wurundjeri country in Melbourne. I spend probably a bit more time than I would like on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in our nation's capital. And the work I'll talk about today really spans studies and that cover country from Noongar country near Perth right up to Ecological country in Cape York. So it's really, I really want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, but also the traditional owners of the land on which all of these studies take place. And I also want to pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are in the audience today. And it's just, it was so great yesterday in the afternoon session about ecologists working on country to see so many TOs there working around how we can be constructive in improving our relationships and our capacity to do work that's two-way and mutually beneficial. So that was a great session. Right. Well, as you know, both April and I have been outed by the Australian and the Courier Mail as anti-coal activists, and so you won't be surprised to see a little bit of commonality in our talks. And maybe we should have chatted before the conference, but I'm going to start with the global context around the state and trends in biodiversity and nature. A little bit recap on April's excellent summary of the national picture, and then talk about the role that ecologists can play in getting us out of this terrible bloody mess. So, back in 1992, our then Minister for the Environment made a commitment, Minister Burke made a commitment to us and to future generations and to the rest of the planet that we were going to, by 2020, reverse the trends and prevent the extinction of species that are currently facing extinction. And sorry, I'm not 1992, 2010. And this is a promise that we've made to ourselves, and it's also enshrined in the CBD. So this is really part of the deep international obligations that we have to protect biodiversity. Those promises were pretty much transcribed verbatim into our global sustainable development goals that are the UN goals for how we're actually going to keep this planet in order. And they include goals around life on land, life under sea, and various other goals. Apart from that one key promise about conserving biodiversity, we made a whole bunch of other promises. Here's the 12 that we made around life on land, and they range from preventing deforestation and all of the fundamental objectives around conservation of biodiversity. So that's a lot of promises. How are we faring? It's quite normal, of course, as you know, for us to make promises without thinking about how we're actually going to measure our progress towards achieving those promises. And unfortunately, the Sustainable Development Goals is one of those little agreements that we made where we didn't quite factor in measuring the outcomes and making sure that we were tracking. But lots of people have been doing an excellent job of trying to redress that so that we can actually see how well we're tracking towards these Sustainable Development Goals. A key initiative that's arisen over the last decade is this IPBES, the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It's very much an IPCC analogy for biodiversity and ecosystem services. I'm sure there are many people here in the room who've contributed directly to the IPBES process, myself included. It's a platform that has 132 country signatories. And its key function is to basically track trends in biodiversity and ecosystem services to provide that regional and global picture about how we're tracking. Most recently, we have had the global assessment on biodiversity and ecosystem services, and I'm going to go through a couple of the key findings there. Right. Key finding of the global assessment. Everything's fine, nothing to worry about here, move on. No, not really. What did they find? Of course, the global assessment recognises that nature underpins all aspects of our life. 2 billion people rely on wood as their primary energy source. 4 billion rely on natural medicines. 70% of all drugs are natural or copies of natural medicines. 75% of all crops are animal pollinated. Natural sinks are the only carbon sinks. The only way we're actually going to reverse current climate trends is to invest in natural sinks. We just can't be sticking coal in the ground and burying it and hope it's going to go away at the rate at which we need to do it if we're actually going to secure anything like the climate trajectory that's going to keep nature and us in the game. So it's really important to remember how important natural carbon sinks are. But unfortunately, nature's capacity to provide these fundamental services that underpin our existence is declining, and it's declining everywhere. So here we have a key result from the IPBES. This is the sort of one of the headline tables that basically talks about how we are degrading nature's capacity to provide key services. So at the top here you can see nature's capacity to contribute to habitat creation and maintenance over the last 50 years has decreased significantly, and it's very much on the way down. And the sorts of indicators that we're using to measure that are the extent of suitable habitat for species, species extinctions, biodiversity intactness and the like. Nature's capacity to provide all of these other services to humans is also declining. So the regulation of air quality, obviously nature does a whole lot of cleaning of air for us. And we've done a reasonably good job in developed nations of coming up with regulations and approaches to minimising emissions of, toxic products into the air, toxic compounds, but that's just in developed nations. So in India in 2017, 1.2 million people died of diseases that were directly related to respiratory problems associated with the lack of clean air. So nature's ability to regulate air quality has dramatically declined over 50 years and continues to decline globally. These are key functions that nature provides, and you can see here not much is really on the way up. And there's a significant amount of uncertainty in some of the areas, like it's a bit unclear exactly how well nature is going to be able to regulate ocean acidification. Coming back to our sort of familiar ground here of biodiversity loss, I guess one of the key things to note about the IPBES process is that it's a huge synthesis exercise. So for the global assessment, there were 300 odd scientists who were actually part of the global assessment process, but they're of course reaching out to thousands of scientists across the planet who are doing the fundamental research that provides the information to underpin these assessments. So here is some work that basically derives from IUCN, and they document extinction over the last 500 years, and you can see here that we have had a dramatic increase in the cumulative number of species going extinct under these taxonomic groups here. So since around 1900, we've lost about 2.5% of our amphibians. That's sort of like our most dramatic case of species extinction across these animal groups. Now, this little grey wedge down here is the proportion of those taxonomic groups that we would have expected to lose under background extinction rates that we measure from the geological time record. So this is why we talk about being in the Anthropocene extinction crisis. It's 100 to 1,000 times the background rate, because we know we know pretty well what the background rate is for these major taxonomic groups, and we're really flying in terms of extinction at the moment. Here's a more detailed summary of IUCN assessments of currently extant species, and you can see that in this table, this x-axis here is telling us the percentage of each of these major taxonomic groups that are actually found to be at risk of extinction through the IUCN assessment process. So, you know, if you're a cycad and you're being assessed by the IUCN, there's about a 60% chance that you're going to be found to be in the vulnerable or endangered categories. So, you know, hopefully there's no cycads in the audience. There's a lot of variation across these taxonomic groups, and the global mean, if you like, for most of the groups is around 25% of species, and that's that headline statistic that April put up before. So 25% of species that are assessed by the IUCN get assessed as being at risk of extinction in one of their threat categories. The insects, the average rate for insects is around 10%. So those two statistics are worth just keeping in mind as we look at this next headline statistic from the IPBES. So the IPBES found that 1 million species are at risk of extinction, which seems astonishing because we haven't actually gotten around to describing many more than 1 million species as a community of taxonomists. And so how can this statistic be so? So the way they worked this out in the IPBES was to basically look at what percentage of species are threatened, how many species do we think are out there, and therefore what are the number that are threatened. And that was done by looking at those proportions from the IUCN of all species that are assessed. So 25% of non-insects tend to be assessed as at risk of extinction once assessment's complete, and about 10% of insects that are assessed are deemed to be at risk of extinction. So if you knew how many non-insects there were and how many insects there were, how many species, then you could kind of figure out what proportion of them and therefore how many species are actually at risk of extinction. And so to do that, they use this work by Morrow that utilises essentially the consistency of species to genus in the tree of life to estimate the number of species of insect that are actually out there and the number of species of other animals and plants that are out there. So this is how they got to this number. There's 2.6 million non-insects, we think, and if 25% of them are threatened, then we've got about 0.65 million animals and plants that are at risk of extinction. And using the same logic, about 500,000 insects that are at risk of extinction. Why they decided to round that down from 1.1 to 1, I guess was probably just a PR idea. Is this a useful number? I think it was a pretty good communication concept at the time. It's our best guess at the moment, and it's obviously a very rubbery number, so maybe that kind of rounding down is totally appropriate for this kind of number. If you want to read a little bit more about that, go and have a look at the IPBES website. It's a little bit depressing. It's a bit like listening to one of April's talks. There's some key other information about, species. It's not just about extinction. So the Living Planet Index is an incredible initiative, and if you haven't read it, have a look at the WWF's Living Planet report. It provides a really great context for not just the species that we've lost or are about to lose, but just species in general. So the Living Planet Index gives you a sense of how the populations of species are changing over time. So they draw this data from 16,000 populations across 4,000 species, and if you consider that in 1970 we considered the biodiversity value of 1970 to be 1, then the proportion of species that we've lost since 1970 is represented by this line, and you can see, the proportion of individuals in populations of species that we've lost since that time is represented by this line. And so that you can see we've lost around 50 to 60% of individuals in populations from this 16,000 populations that they utilise in the Living Planet Index. So we're not only losing species, we're actually losing abundance of species in a really dramatic fashion. And this is reflected in no group better than in the pollinators, and this is a major issue for humans. So 90% of wild flowering plants and 70% of crop species are actually depend on animals for pollination, and 80% of that is actually insects. And we've seen a 75% decline in 27 years in Europe of flying insects. Well, that was a study in Germany, actually, not the whole of Europe, but the European, I've got to stop pressing that forward button too soon. The European butterflies, thank you. The European butterflies, there was a study that observed that since 1990, they lost half. It's just astonishing, these rates of change in the abundance of insects, astonishing and terrifying. And it's probably the one thing that's sort of pushing through a little bit into the media at the moment, which is good while it's terrifying. And we're losing honeybee hives, we're losing pollinators. 30% of bees that are assessed by the IUCN are actually assessed as being at risk of extinction. And so in the IPBES report, using these ecosystem service accounting methods, they reckon we stand to lose about $570 billion a year in crop productivity due to wild pollinator loss, which is kind of absurd, isn't it? Because if you lose wild pollinators and you lose crops, I think that $570 billion will be the last thing we'll be worried about. We'll have people starving to death and mass migration of humans across the planet, and basically apocalypse. So, loss of wild pollinators has a financial and an existential angle to it, there's no doubt. What are the drivers of these changes globally? We've already heard that 75% of land area has been significantly altered in modern history. 66% of the ocean is experiencing increased cumulative impacts. 85% of wetland areas have been lost. Holy crap, 85% of wetlands. It's just such an astonishing proportion of wetlands to be lost, not just changed a bit, got a bit of plastic in them, but actually lost. These are obviously quite depressing statistics, and I'm going to get to some fun stuff in a minute. This is a kind of a nice visual image, I think, from the Living Planet report. Again, they call this the Great Acceleration Graph, and if you just sort of squint and don't worry too much about the actual titles of each of these graphs, and just let me point you a couple. World population increasing like this, up now around 8 billion. The shapes of the graphs pretty much all map that population change. Gives you a pretty strong indication. I mean, I'm not much of a modeller, but you know, there's a pretty strong indication of what's driving all of this. As you see this growth in world population and human activity, you see this commensurate rise in carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide in the atmosphere, and you see terrestrial biosphere degradation, all of these indices, ocean acidification, all going up at that exponential and terrifying rate that maps pretty perfectly onto human population growth. So the Great Acceleration is a rather terrifying thing. If anybody's been fortunate enough to see Leslie Hughes give a talk about climate change, although that can tend to be a bit depressing as well, you may have seen this graph already. I'm sorry if you have. I still find it incredibly compelling, and sometimes I get a bit choky when I look at it, so I'm just going to look this way. But this basically is a graphic that was put together by a gentleman in Finland who wanted to show how temperature anomalies, so by temperature anomaly we mean how much is the average temperature how much is the temperature in a given year deviated from the 100-year average. And so if you look at 1880, and the names here are just all the different countries, and if you get a big red blob, that means you are at least 2 degrees higher than the long-term average in that year, and if you get a blue blob, that means you were around 2 degrees cooler. And so let's play that now. Through the Industrial Revolution, everything's fine. We don't know about climate change yet. And then we still have those little mini ice ages. I remember being incredibly cold as a kid in the 70s growing up. If you had tried to convince me about climate change, I would have not believed you. And then you just start to see that warming that we're all aware of now, that quite strong evidence of a signal of change. And then suddenly, through these last sort of 5 or 6 years, we keep getting the hottest year on record, or the second or third hottest year on record. So the story is just so clear, and this is obviously already a driver. And I've had some very depressing conversations with some colleagues, including Hugh and Kat from Arid Recovery, about just how dramatic we're seeing the climate impacts on a number of the species that they're trying to look after, and everyone in this room can tell similar stories, I'm sure. So how are we progressing towards our Sustainable Development Goals? I'm just focusing here on our life on land and life under sea goals, and basically the story is, see this little asterisk here? It's kind of depressing and said in that really like nice way, that Germanic way that Joseph Settle says things. There were no targets that were scored as good or positive status or trends. So we're looking at the really shit versus the quite shit column, to use some of Megan Good's language from her talk yesterday, which was fabulous. I hope you saw it. So we see here that these basic measures of our performance against Sustainable Development Goals ensure conservation of terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems. We have poor or declining support for achieving that goal. We're not going to achieve that goal. And you can see that most of our goals are either really poor or quite poor in terms of our performance or progress towards those goals. So this is a fairly comprehensively negative conclusion about where we're going to be when we reflect on our performance against Sustainable Development Goals in a couple of years. So, in summary, goals for conserving and sustainably using nature cannot be met under current trajectories. Only transformative change will allow goals to be met by 2030. That's the key finding, the overarching finding from the IPBES. This story is not lost on radical left-wing think tanks like the World Economic Forum. In their Global Risks report in 2019, they actually have put biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse natural disasters, extreme weather events, and failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation as the key risks to the global economy. Out of all of these other risks, and this is a standard risk matrix, of course. As you go to the right, you have on this x-axis, you have higher likelihood of occurrence. As you go up, you have higher impact. So everything in this top right corner is the really serious stuff that we're most concerned about. And these sorts of things that we tend to worry about in our political discourse, like energy prices and inflation, are down here. So the World Economic Forum puts our problems at the top of their list of concerns about the global economy. In Australia, we've already heard a little bit about this today. Just for those of you who haven't heard this before, and this is thanks to Zoos Victoria, that's the last recorded call of the Christmas Island pipistrelle. Nobody will ever hear that in the wild again. We've lost 110 species. We should talk about our numbers. I talked to John Winarski. Who do you talk to? Since European invasion, we have 1,800 species now listed as at high risk of extinction. A third of those are not monitored, so we could be losing them right now and we wouldn't know. 40% of them don't have a recovery plan, and you no longer have to have a recovery plan if you're listed under the EPBC Act, but I won't get into the details of that. We've already heard enough about that. Here's that disturbingly linear increase in cumulative mammal extinctions, and thanks to John Winarski for his incredible work over decades on this, documenting this change. This graph's been shown already once today. How do we perform in terms of extinctions? You remember this graph here I talked about a little moment ago? That's the proportion of species in these taxonomic groups that have been lost since 1500. Here's mammals, around 2%. In Australia, we've lost over 10% of the mammals that existed when Europeans invaded Australia. So we are really, we are the undisputed world champions of mammal extinction at the moment. So that's a sort of an Australia versus the world. And here's the cumulative increase in just extinctions of all of our animals and plants in Australia over the last couple of 100 years. Again, thanks to John for compiling this information and the people involved in that publication. Again, disturbingly linear upward, no real bending of the curve on that one, unfortunately. Analogous to the Living Planet Index, Eliza Bayraktarov has produced Australia's first threatened species index. This is the story for birds. Incredible effort. She's pulled all of this data together in collaboration with BirdLife and literally hundreds of data providing partners. So what's the story here? In 1985, if we consider populations of all of these bird species in 1985 to be fixed as 1, over the ensuing sort of 35 years, we've lost more than half. So on average, population sizes of threatened birds have decreased by about 50% since 1985. And 1985 is not that long ago. I see it as a number of people out here, I'm quite sure, remember 1985 very well. I was actually on a school excursion in Launceston in 1985, and my enduring memory, I didn't have much of an eye for architecture at that time. All I remember was that some guy had a swing at me when I was walking down the street in the mall. But I find Launceston now to be a very friendly place, and I've had a lovely couple of days. So yes, amazing work from Elisa and the Threatened Species Hub on creating the Threatened Species Index. This issue of our extinctions is not lost on the world. Anthony Waldron and colleagues in this really important paper in Nature pointed out that Australia has the highest rate of biodiversity loss in the developed world and the second highest rate of biodiversity loss of any country on the planet. And so this is a pretty important recognition internationally of our track record in biodiversity loss. What's driving our losses? It's kind of the same as for everywhere else on the planet. Habitat loss, invasive species, disease and overexploitation. But there's a particular place for invasive species in the history of biodiversity loss in this country. We know, and we've heard a lot in the last couple of years, and thanks in part to the work of our Threatened Species Hub, just how damaging feral predators are for a lot of our birds, mammals and reptiles, and the work by Sarah Legg and Brett Murphy here that highlighted that we lose about 360 million birds a year to cats alone, really, I think, really resonated in the public and with politicians. So it's a really important thing to acknowledge, but of course we should also acknowledge the other really significant threats that are driving biodiversity down in this country. So the big question here to the audience, there's a couple of young people in the front here, which species, which threat and which invasive species threatens the largest number of endangered species? Young man.
I think it's rabbit.
Oh my goodness, you got it. Zadie would have got it too. Of course, great work here from Stephen Kearney, who's characterised what the driving threats are that are pressing most heavily on our listed species. And of course, it is the European rabbit, because most of our threatened species are plants, something we sometimes forget. So the other obvious thing here is that extreme weather, fire and climate are the new norm now. You will have all been, very familiar with the news around the Menindee fish kills, the spectacled flying fox climate event. And I've got these couple of species here because they could just go in one fire. One big fire in Western Australia, and all the natural populations, or even the captive population of this one, could go in one single catastrophic environmental event. So these extremes are really going to more and more, I think, drive the extinction profile in Australia. So, oh my God, this is so depressing. If you weren't already depressed enough after the last talk, probably you're actually thinking about leaving or changing careers. So, what are the things that we can do as an ecologist to actually try and turn this around? What can we possibly do? So I'm going to go through a little list of things because I like lists. I'm going to start with prosecuting the case for adequate resourcing for threatened species recovery. So, some good news. Waldron, again, what an incredible contribution he's made over the last couple of years, analysed the relationship between conservation spending and biodiversity loss. And you can see that as you increase conservation spending, you actually reduce the amount of biodiversity loss. This is across a pattern that they've observed across all countries that they analysed. And so that's a really important message. Conservation spending works, and if we actually invest, we can reduce biodiversity loss. Here's some more evidence for that. In the United States, Suckling and Co. Looked at how populations of birds that were listed under the Endangered Species Act performed after their listing. And the result was that on average, you get around a 600% increase in the populations of birds that are listed. Now, this is complicated, obviously. It's not just about resourcing, it's about regulation and it's about other things. But this is really crucial information. If you list a species under the Endangered Species Act in the United States, it's actually quite likely to do better than before you listed it. And that's not really something that we can claim about our own act at the moment. And part of that is that resourcing for recovery is mandated under the Endangered Species Act in the United States. You have to cough up the money once it's listed and you have a recovery plan. It's a really important difference. Who collected these data? Ecologists, of course. We need ecologists to prosecute this case and to demonstrate when things are working and demonstrate when things are not working. How are we going with our spending? Well, we've already heard a little bit about this today. Here's my take on it. In the United States, they spend on targeted threatened species recovery every year around 2 to 2.5 billion Australian dollars on threatened species recovery. In Australia, our total environment budget is around 500 million. You get a few little peaks here and there around particular initiatives, but basically our environment budget sits here. there's some uncertainty about what might happen to the United States budgets, but, you know, it's going to have to change a lot for it to come down to where we're at. And this is our estimates of the targeted towards threatened species recovery, targeted spending of the Commonwealth in 2017, 2018. You can kind of double that when you put in the states' contributions, and it's worth acknowledging, I think, that the Commonwealth has started to reorient some of its spending to be more towards threatened species through the Regional Land Partnerships Program and the National Landcare Program. But, you know, it's not going to get us up here. And it is worth remembering that the United States has fewer species listed on its threatened species legislation than we have on ours. So they're doing a lot better per species. We decided to sort of use that United States example as an approach to figuring out, well, what should we be spending per species if we want to achieve the kinds of recovery that's been seen in the United States across many of their listed species. We took this boneheadedly simple approach, thanks Don, to actually work it out. We said, on average, per species in the United States, under these different taxonomic groups, how much do they spend per species, you know, on average, or the median US allocation to a threatened plant's around $70,000 a year. We multiplied that up by the number of species we have in those taxonomic groups to give us a very rough first order estimate of what we think we should be spending to recover threatened species, based on all sorts of heroic assumptions about the conditions there and the conditions here and all of that sort of stuff. But this is first pass. It's somewhere between $1 billion and $2 billion a year. That's what we need to get up to if we're going to have a snowflakes in hell chance of actually recovering the species that we've got on our list. And so you might make the case that things are tougher here. We've got a big country with population densities that are lower and lots of invasive species, and maybe we'd actually need more to do this in Australia. But this is our first pass. Sounds like a lot of money. Well, not really. As a nation, we spend $580 million a year on pet grooming. When we think about pet accessories, so like, you know, collars with diamantes and stuff like that, $1.1 billion a year, that's what we spend. $2.5 billion a year on cat care and cat food. And there are some other major things like, you know, $900 million a year on fuel tax concessions to coal mining companies, and I won't even talk about the $40 billion on defence. So, you know, I think as a nation, we can afford to lift our game and actually provide the levels of spending that are required to actually conserve threatened species. We can afford it. Ecologists have a crucial role in informing regenerative agriculture and biodiversity carbon farming. I think this is the second most important game at the moment. I'll get to the most important one in a minute. 60% of Australia is under some form of agriculture, and 80% of it is private land or Indigenous owned and managed land. So if we're not working with farmers to try and improve agricultural practices, we're not going to have any chance of actually conserving biodiversity in this country. It's a crucial endeavour. There's some great initiatives. A shout out to Michelle Young and David Lindemeyer for their Sustainable Farms initiative out of ANU. They're doing some excellent things and sort of, I think, leading the way and setting a good example for how we can move. I also wanted to mention that Jim's just secured a significant grant to actually develop some of this work out of La Trobe. So it's just great to see that this stuff is being led by ecologists, and that's what we need to be doing. We've got to be getting ecologists informing the way farming actually happens to be good for people and good for nature. And this is a great bit of work by Anthelia and Patrick O'Connor from South Australia, where they've actually cobbled together data over more than a decade to actually demonstrate what you get when you have a stewardship incentive payment to farmers. And this is just an amazing bit of research, and the most amazing thing is just how they managed to keep the data collection going through patchy funding and actually tell this story in a very statistically robust way. So again, ecologists doing amazing things, telling the story about what you can get when you try and improve agricultural practices. This, I think, is the most important game in town. Two-way learning. We need to, as a professional group, we need to be supporting traditional owner land management. Okay, we know that around half of our protected area estate in this country is managed by Indigenous people under the IPAs, Indigenous Protected Areas, and they're definitely not getting half the resources of the NRS to do that. There's a whole lot to be gained from mutually beneficial research and work with traditional owners to make sure that we're actually getting the best possible outcomes that we can get for nature and people in this country. And there's some wonderful examples already. We've heard some wonderful examples at this conference. I want to just mention this work by Anya Scroblin as part of a partnership with KJ and Martu people in Martu country. This is a great example of a partnership, a co-design, a co-production and a co-reporting of the outcomes. Anya has helped design the monitoring programs in a way that the Martu Rangers wanted it to be. They're monitoring the things they want to monitor in the way that they want to monitor, and we're able to bring that stuff together to do some surprisingly robust statistical analysis of trends in the monitoring data around bilby. So it's a really wonderful bit of work. I'd also like to make a shout out to the Garajari people who are here and for the partnership that they've initiated with Sarah Legg from the Threatened Species Hub, again to help with monitoring design, to evaluate the outcomes of changing to right-way fire. So I think this is a really good example again of right-way science initiated by TOs in the Garajari, and I guess it's probably worth mentioning some of the great work that Bush Heritage has been doing over the last 10 years in this space, and such an important space, and we really actually, if we're not working together over the lands that are managed by TOs, we are actually not going to solve this problem. Informing law and policy, I can almost just skip this. It's you're now very well aware that we're having a review of our EPBC Act. Unfortunately, in many ways, it doesn't compare very well to the Endangered Species Act. I think there's a lot to be learnt from that. But when our statutory review of our Act is couched as a green tape review, I think we have reason to be concerned, and I think April has actually highlighted that very nicely and eloquently this morning, so I won't go on about that. But please do put in a submission. There's opportunities in this review. We can move up to approaches that analyse cumulative impacts and do a much better job of making sure that we don't suffer a death by 1,000 cuts through biodiversity loss. And some great work here by Amy Whitehead and Haney Kula, where they're working with the West Australian government to try and improve the Perth and Peel plan. Responding to global environmental change, this is a key challenge, as we said. We're going to have massive changes. Here's some work by Nikki Mitchell that's really led by the DBCA and WA and the Perth Zoo, doing radical things like translocating western swamp tortoise to places where they think that they can breed and get better outcomes. And they are, and Nikki's providing that science support that helps really understand why. A shout out to Nat Briscoe. You can see her talk this afternoon. She specialises in analysing hot fluffy koalas, and she's been able to identify where in the current range we expect a dramatic change in environmental suitability based on climate extremes for this species. So go and hear a bit more about how she does her work this afternoon. And I think this work by Kristen Williams and colleagues at CSIRO through the ADAPT NRM process is really game-changing. I know for a fact that it's having an influence on some key NGO work around how they manage climate change impacts on their properties and their assets. It's a really beautifully presented report, this ADAPT NRM report, the implications for climate change, gives a very clear picture of how we see the environmental composition of an area changing over time and the sort of damage that it can do to biodiversity and what you need to do about it. So check that out, please. Systems thinking. Only ecologists can think this way. that may be a good or a bad thing. But there's some amazing work characterising complex systems, and I just wanted to point to some work that Terry Walsh and Libby Rumpf have been doing in Victoria, helping the Victorian government develop their biodiversity knowledge framework, and that is based on these cause and effect systems thinking approaches. And this is a real strength that we have in our ecological community, and we should make the most of it. It's really great work. Finally, I think we have the role of reinforcing hope. So ecologists really sort of own that space of the awe and wonder of nature. And we have a really big responsibility to keep people's hopes up. And I know that seems ironic given the last two talks, but this is an incredibly important role for ecologists to tell the stories about when the work we do does succeed. And this book by Stephen Garnett and colleagues, I think, is a really nice reference point for how you can make threatened species recovery work, and I thoroughly recommend you check it out. So, does the world need ecologists right now? Absolutely, abso-bloody-lutely, because if we've got a current situation where our statutory review of our flagship threatened species legislation is being couched as a green tape cutting exercise, when you've got the shame heaped on scientists because they talk about climate change when half of the Great Eastern Ranges is on fire, I think now is the time when we really need ecologists to be getting into the public debate and talking about our future. Thanks very much.